What's going on, folks? Ted from Immersion here, and we're continuing with our Critical Role Call of the Netherdeep coverage. And if we go and look at the table of contents, I'll show you what we're going to talk about today, but I'll just throw it out there. If you like what I'm doing here, this coverage, apparently some of you didn't even know this book was coming out until I made these videos, so glad to be the bearer of good news or bad news for your wallet. I don't know how it works, but anyway, glad you're aware now. I was going to do this. I had Appendix C here is listed as the Medals of Merit, and I was like, oh, I'll do a video on that. But having looked at it, the magic items section where we covered all of those different medals in the previous video, that's actually what Appendix C is. So if I were to click on that, it's actually just little cutouts or things that you can photocopy to give little handouts to your players if they earn the Medals of Merit, which are earned from a part of the adventure in Chapter 1, where the party is essentially going through and doing a series of contests in the starting town, and if they win at the given contest, they're given the associated Medal of Merit for whatever they have achieved. So there's no reason to focus on that, so we're going to talk about the Fragments of Suffering, which again are a similar aspect. So if we look at the Medals of Merit appendices, though, it does say the cards, which is interesting that this isn't in Appendix D, it's in Appendix C, but it says the cards in Appendix D are not meant to be given to players whose characters gain Fragments of Suffering in Chapter 6. If you click on the Fragments of Suffering appendix, it actually doesn't list any of how you access those. I thought it was weird to include it in the previous appendices, but I will also now give you spoilers and tell you spoiler warning for the Fragments of Suffering, as we are going to talk a little bit about how you gain Fragments of Suffering and then what they are, so consider this a spoiler warning if you don't want to have that, again, spoiled for you. All right, here we go. So the Fragments of Suffering, this is in sort of the Netherdeep section of it, and it says, to enter the Heart of Despair, where the Apotheon is imprisoned, the character must have absorbed at least one fragment of suffering, and basically a representation of the emotions felt by the Apotheon. There's 9 fragments. These are where they're located, what they're called, and where they're located within the adventure. And then here's how it works, right? As an action, a creature can touch a fragment, it can see, and then absorb the fragment into their body. It gives them a card, which we're going to talk about, which gives them basically a benefit and a detriment. It becomes part of the creature's soul until they die, transferring the fragment to another creature, or they enter the Heart of Despair. A creature can absorb up to 3 fragments, if they so choose. If a creature that carries 3 fragments tries to absorb a 4th one, it doesn't work. And then a creature can use an action to transfer one fragment it's carrying to another creature by touching the fragment's intended recipient. And when a fragment leaves a creature, that creature loses the benefit and drawback conferred by the fragment, making sense. And if they initiate a transfer, have that character's player give the corresponding cards to the new recipient. If a creature that is carrying a fragment dies or enters the Heart of Despair, the fragment immediately leaves the creature and returns to its original location. And that is pretty much it. So let's go ahead and look at the fragments. So first up, we have the Fragment of Abhorrence. Once on each of your turns, when you hit a creature with a weapon attack roll, you can force that target to move up to 10 feet away from you in a direction of your choice. A creature that can't be frightened is immune to this effect. And then the drawback of it is, if you start your turn frightened, you take 2d6 psychic damage. So that's pretty interesting, because if you have an ability or a means to make yourself not affected by frightened, like for example a level 10 paladin is immune to frightened, this could be a huge useful boon for you, because there is no downside, because you'll never be considered frightened, because you can't be, but it also doesn't say that you need to be able to be frightened to gain access to this fragment. And it says 10 feet away from you in a direction of your choice. That could be up, that could be down, backwards, off a cliff. Interesting. Fragment of Despondence. You are immune to the Charmed condition, but you can't take the Help action. This is very interesting, and this concept, I read this one, and it got me really interested for what kind of interesting mechanics and things you can do. Not necessarily you need to absorb or, adapt this Fragments of Suffering concept to your game, but this could be a really fun way if you want to deal with a cursed magic item, right? You want to give any of these drawbacks could be applied to any magic item or thing in your game as a curse that's beset on the players by an evil witch or a hag or a dragon or whatever. It could be beset on them as part of a curse for a magic item, or it could be some sort of high risk, high reward thing that you give to your players where they're given something really powerful, but to offset it, it has a set of drawbacks. And you can use these as examples for things to import into your own game, or just use them right as they're listed here. All right, the Fragment of Melancholy. When you fail a Wisdom or Charisma saving throw, you can re-roll it with advantage, potentially turning it into a success, which is a once per long rest. The drawback is if you use this Fragment's benefit and it doesn't turn a failed saving throw into a success, you are incapacitated until the end of your next turn, overcome with despair. Wow. On the face value, I was like, oh, this is pretty strong. You know, you can kind of get a re-roll once per long rest, but yeah, if it doesn't. So obviously you won't use it until you fail. So you'd have to make a Wisdom or Charisma saving throw, and the DM would tell you fail, which would then trigger you to use this. But if it doesn't turn it into a success, could be absolutely brutal, especially if this is during the course of a combat. You being incapacitated until the end of your next turn essentially will take you out of combat, possibly at least for a full turn. The Fragment of Attachment. You can't be frightened while within 10 feet of an ally. If you're already frightened and move within 10 feet of an ally, the frightening condition ends on you. And the drawback is you have disadvantage on Wisdom and Charisma saving throws while you aren't within 10 feet of an ally. So again, the sort of attachment piece here, it is sort of a benefit friends situation. That sounds like I said friends with benefits. That's not what I meant, but almost like a pack tactics. If your allies are nearby, you can't be frightened, but if they separate from you, it's going to provide you disadvantage on Wisdom and Charisma saves. I'm also very interested to see how some of these could interact with one another. For example, this one makes you so you can't be frightened if there's an ally, which would then pair pretty well with Fragment of Abhorrence, where if you start your turn frightened, you take damage, but you wouldn't be able to be frightened if you had an ally nearby. Same thing with this one, will give you advantage on a Wisdom or Charisma saving throw that you fail. This one gives you disadvantage on saving throws, so you could possibly use those to counteract each other. Fragment of Intrasignance. Another creature can't force you to move anywhere you don't want to go. So basically you can be firmly planted on the ground, but you can't take the disengage or dodge action. That one, I think the help action you could probably get away with depending on the campaign. It may not be something that's super useful or used often, but having access to the disengage or dodge action is pretty critical if it gets into high-level combat. Fragment of Pity. Each time you spend a hit die to regain hit points, you regain additional hit points equal to your proficiency bonus. That's pretty nice, but you have disadvantage on death saving throws. So again, this is another one of those high-risk, high-reward scenarios. If you don't often find your character going down or having to make death saving throws, then you probably won't find any disadvantage with this, because as long as you're able to stay happy and healthy in your combats and whatnot, you don't have to worry about the death saves. And you get that little bit of extra healing if you guys use hit dice, which once again, that has to be in a situation where you're taking short rests or things that are expending your hit die. Otherwise, that feature doesn't really matter too much. But once again, I will say that you could adapt as a simple magic item, a magical boon for someone or something, that top piece, right? Each time you spend hit die to regain hit points, increase that amount by your proficiency bonus. That could be a simple magic item or part of a magical item effect. That could again be a boon granted to a party member, perhaps a certain school. If people train at it, it allows them to have access to that ability. Again, I always try to see these things that some people might get really close-minded on them about what they're for and what they're supposed to be used at, but if you really start to expand that a little bit further, you realize that a lot of this can be sampled and stolen and reused in your campaigns, and again, no one needs to be the wiser unless you tell them. Fragment of Deception. When you take damage, you can use your reaction to turn invisible and teleport up to 60 feet to an unoccupied space you can see. You remain invisible until the start of your next turn or until you make a damage roll or cast a spell. So it does allow you to do certain things while staying invisible. This is a really nice kind of oh shit button where you can use your reaction to turn invisible and teleport, so nobody knows where you went. This is also not quantified as a spell, so nothing can counterspell you doing this, but it also gives you disadvantage on wisdom checks. That's probably going to be the most prominent one, would be things like survival checks and perception checks, which are usually things you want to be good at, but, you know, take that with a grain of salt. Fragment of Loathing. When a creature damages you with a weapon attack or a spell, you can focus your hatred on that creature. Until the end of your next turn, you have disadvantage on attack rolls you make against... you have advantage on attack rolls you make against that creature, but you can only focus on one at a time. And then you have disadvantage on charisma checks. Honestly, that one sounds like the biggest win to me, other than the first one allowing you to possibly circumvent the drawback entirely with immunity to the frightened condition. Charisma checks aren't too often, and if you're not the face of the party, that likely may not come up often. And it would give you the opportunity to pick a creature, focus down on them, and get advantage on attack rolls against them. That's pretty strong, and it also doesn't have a limit. It's not like once per long rest. That's just a thing you can do all the time. You have to be hit first to initiate it, but then, yeah, until the end of your next turn, you have advantage on attack rolls made against that creature. And, you know, if you're in the thick of combat often, getting hit is pretty high, chance is pretty high, and then it'll trigger this pretty early. And then lastly, the Fragment of Rancor. When you hit a creature with an attack, you can choose to deal an extra 2d6 psychic damage to the creature, or 46 psychic damage to each other creature within 5 feet of it. After you use this benefit, you must finish a short or long rest before you can use it again. And the drawback is whenever you are not unconscious and fail a saving throw, you take 2d6 psychic damage. Once again, if you happen to find some way to give yourself resistance to psychic damage, possibly flat out immunity to psychic damage, this thing could be a huge benefit to you. You can either use it as sort of like a mini smite sneak attack thing where you hit somebody and do an extra 2d6 psychic damage. Again, if you crit, that would turn into 46 damage. Or do 46 psychic damage to each other creature within 5 feet of that target. So that target, from reading it that way where it says each other creature, it makes me think like if I pick this guy as the target, all of the other creatures around him within 5 feet take the 46 psychic damage. As far as I can tell, that also impacts you, but the wording on some of these are a little difficult. It's a shorter long rest mechanic, and then whenever you fall unconscious, whenever you're not unconscious and fail any saving throw of any kind, you take 2d6 psychic damage. But again, if you happen to have resistance or immunity to psychic damage in some way, there's no downside to that one. And then the last thing is a printable image that you can go ahead and put together to print out to be able to cut up and hand out to your party members as you see fit. So there you go, folks. That is the Fragments of Suffering as contained in the Critical Role Call of the Netherdeep book. I think they're really interesting. Like I said, I think there would be great material to adapt and change up to fit into your own campaign, which they've done a lot of the work for you. It's just finding a way to make it work. So with that being said, we are nearing the end of our Critical Role Call of the Netherdeep content. The next thing we're going to cover in this series is the creatures, the new monsters and the rivals and things like that. And that's going to be it. And we'll be done with this book. We'll be able to close it and then go back and hit all the backlog stuff that I haven't covered already. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.